Okay.
Okay, we'll start with this one. We're going to do a photo album tour now, and we'll just start right here, and you can tell us about this picture.
This is my mother, and even though she lived in Java, we had Bismarck as our headquarters for a number of the Germans from Russia annual conventions. And so we brought Mother to the convention, and that particular year, in 1981, she dug out a dress that her grandmother wore in Russia for a wedding. She wore that dress for the costume contest, and of course she won first prize for that, and there she's displaying that the ribbon that she won. And she was so terribly proud of that. I can still remember the smile on her face when she was awarded that, because not very often that our elderly pioneers were given something so valuable as a ribbon for being dressed the way they were.
Were you close to your mother when you were growing up?
Yeah, Mother was a wonderful person. She had more patience than anyone I can think of, contrary to my father, especially when I think of that particular quality of life that she had. We were close to Mother, and she nurtured us. Father was kind of, well, always busy with other affairs and business things and so forth. So we were close to Mother. Yeah.
And talk about this picture here.
Now that picture, again, she's wearing the same clothes. So what I'm thinking right now is that they took that picture either before or after that convention, but this is in their house in Java. And whenever my father sat down to play the organ, which after they were retired and living in town, and we can talk about that some other time, he sat down, the old pump organ, of course. And when he sat down to play the organ, Mother was singing, and she sang all those songs. And this is something that it's almost a miracle with the limited education she had. She she learned English, and she could converse with anybody in either language. And so she sang, but always in German, I suppose, church songs and whatever, while Dad played away on the organ.
Do you know if your dad ever had lessons on the organ? Or?
No, he was a self-taught musician, and at age 10, he learned to play violin. We can talk about that when we see the church picture. And and shortly thereafter, the church, small country church, purchased an organ, and then he learned to play the organ, and he led the singing. And so he just continued in that profession, playing the organ for the church for the next over 40 years. But there's an era which we haven't talked about yet, when Dad was 18, 19, 20 years old. He played violin for dances. He became a fiddler, if you will. So he played both, as you referred to it, violin playing and fiddle playing. And the fiddling, of course, was for dancing. And then, and we have this downstairs in our house, a portable organ. It folds up into the size of a suitcase. And he would take his violin or fiddle with him and that organ and play for local dances. So he was self-taught, but he did well. In fact, he made sure that all of us learned the notes and enough that we could play the organ, and many of us just haven't continued with it, so we forgot everything we knew. But we all learned to play, at least fundamentally, the organ and the violin.
Did any of the kids ever play at dances or anything like that?
No, 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 no. But he talked about it. He talked about it.
Martin did.
Oh yeah, my older brother did. He played piano because he also played organ. Yeah. Thank you. I had forgotten about that. So
Okay.
that's good. But the family is musical in all respects. You know, everyone has a talent in that area. Now then, we have this publication, which is a German from Russia publication, and it struck me that we've never really published a story about my parents, so getting information from my father and mother both, I decided to do a story called My Father's Story, and it's written in the first person. So this first picture that we're looking at is my grandfather Bauman and my grandmother Bauman. Unfortunately, I didn't get to know her because she passed away 4 months after my birth. And this was my dad, and it says here, my father, Frederick Bauman, age 38, and mother, Rosina Christiana Fiechner Bauman, age 24, and then my dad was 11 months old. Now here's the interesting thing about that picture. They came to the United States in April 1893. My father was born November 1892, so that figures he was 6 months old when they came to the United States. And they homesteaded, and this is the place they homesteaded on the farm. I didn't grow up on this farm. This was Grandpa's farm, and that was 5 miles east of Java, South Dakota. They apparently had no photographer there that they trusted, so they drove by team, wagon, and horses to Eureka, South Dakota to have that picture taken. That's the interesting part of that story because that's 30 miles away. It took them 2 days to get there. It took another day, 2 days to come back, so they probably spent a full week just to get that particular photograph. And that's kind of. Now this picture down here is where their Grandpa Bauman's homestead was. And the picture here with the horse and the surrey and my father standing by it. I think he was probably 16 years old, Grandpa and Grandma. And then there were some of my aunts, other uncles, and probably a stranger, another girl there. Initially, they lived in this little white house, which they built in 1893. Later, that became a summer kitchen, and they built a bigger and nicer house. A picket fence surrounded the garden. My grandfather, apparently, he had been exposed to a lot of, I don't know, agriculture and so forth in Russia. He immediately planted a number of fruit trees. And as I recall, even when I was young, that was a virtual orchard. He had plum trees, he had apple trees, he had prune trees, he had every kind of fruit there. And that gave them an abundance. Oh yes, and grapes, because my father talked about stomping grapes in the big wash tub to make wine. Oh, must have been interesting. Anyway, so the outbuildings there and the small trees, and this is the garden down here with trees around it. In fact, we used that. My dad bought this farm later on, many years later, and I remember plowing this garden for my mother.
So
Okay?
is this where you grew up then?
This is a quarter-mile from where I grew up.
Okay.
Our farm was just up the hill from this one, where my father built the
So
farm
did you
for
visit
himself.
this place quite often?
Oh, yes, yes, as often as we could. Yeah. They later built a large barn and replaced this one.
You said you didn't know your grandmother,
No.
but you knew your grandfather. What
Yeah.
type of a grandfather was he?
Oh, it's a very. Oh, he was ambitious. He worked. He worked. He kind of felt that he owed his life to anyone who would board and room him after grandmother had passed away. And he spent a lot of time living in our home with us, and he just worked. He worked spring, summer, fall, winter, whatever, and helped with the farm work. And in exchange for that, my dad would give him money for tobacco and for his clothing, and probably a few dollars for some schnapps, and that was all he wanted in exchange for a place to live and to have food and shelter. Yes, it was interesting. Now he lived until age 74, and he had I think cancer, uh, which took his life away.
You said your grandmother died when you were 1. Do you know how she died?
Well, all I can tell you is that her death certificate, which I learned from someone else, just said depression. And and as the story goes, she spent more than the last couple of years of her life just not being able to cope with the world. She was bedridden most of the time for that very reason. And that's really all that was ever related to us. I don't think anyone else ever added anything to that particular story. This is my mother and father celebrating um, their 62nd wedding anniversary, and that's in their home. We gathered in their house in Java. In 1950, after Marilyn and I were married, we built a house in Java for my parents, and that year they moved to town. So the picture that we saw a while ago of him playing organ and mother singing, that's in Java. Okay?
Okay. We're going to put this picture on as well. I know we already looked at it, but we can just put it on as well, just to kind of, because it is a good picture.
It's kind of a negative, but it's been used. It was used to reproduce in that book.
And we'll use this one probably too. It's a good quality. So, works well. Okay.
This now is a map. They call it the Old Country. And when you ask people where they came from in Russia, they just simply say Odessa. Because Odessa was the big city by the seaport, by the Black Sea, but about 60 kilometers north and northeast was the village that my parents, as well as Marilyn's grandparents and ancestors, immigrated from. From from the little village, they would go to Odessa, and from Odessa, they would make their way by train or other means up to Bremen or Hamburg, Germany, and board a vessel for America at that point. So this map pretty well depicts all the different small villages.
And your family's from this area right here?
Yeah. Right up in here.
Okay.
And
Is that both your mother's side and
yeah,
your father's side?
exactly. They lived in the same village.
Did they know each other before they immigrated?
I don't know whether they did or not. If they, the older people did, I would guess so, because they undoubtedly went attended the same church, and so it's. I don't know. I have a feeling that they probably did. There were probably as many as 1,500 or more people living in a village that size. The land they farmed was on the outside of the village, so you could refer to them as sidewalk farmers. They went out to their land on the outskirts of the village and did their farming.
Okay, and what do we have here?
This is a plat of the village of Hofnustal, and that's where our ancestors lived after they left Germany in the middle 1800s. And this village was established in 1816, and thereabouts. I may be off a year. Between 1816 and 1818, this little plat received its crown from the Russian Empire. And so they left Germany and followed either a trail alongside the Danube or went by boat on the Danube River to an area near Odessa, and from that point they made their way north into these villages. The Russian soldiers helped these people locate areas where they wished them to settle. So
And this has the family name of both you, your
we have
mother.
highlighted here family names of both our ancestors on Marilyn's side and on mine. There are Fiechners and there are Sowers and there are Rosines and Baumans, and there may be some other names there that are highlighted, but basically um, that's where they were. They all came from there. They had a school in the center of the village and a church also in the center of the village, and that brings up something that I'm reminded of. My mother was 10 years old when they left Russia, and so she attended the school, which was in the center of that, as well as others, of course. But she's the only one who ever told me a story about attending school there, and they had a German Lehrer calling the instructor in the forenoon, and then they had a Russian instructor afternoons, split half days for each, because in in 18 about 18 close to 1870, the Russian emperor decided that it's time that we take away the privileges that we granted these people to come from Germany, and now we're going to Russianize them. So they're going to need to learn the Russian language. At that time, they began conscripting our German people into the army. And so all this was happening about the same time within a period of just a few short years. and and my mother loved the German half day, but she didn't like the other half day with the Russian. And being age 10, kids have their own mind. By that time, she would not learn Russian, the Russian language. She didn't like it, and she refused to learn it. So the consequences, of course, were very cruel punishment every day. She said her punishment was going to the corner, kneeling on kernels of corn the entire half day for 2 or 3 hours. And so, of course, the consequences were that she was bleeding through the skin every single day. But she held off. She wouldn't learn Russian.
Did she ever mention what the voyage was like to you when she
Yes,
came over?
I was getting to that. The village, it had a sandstone house, and in the backyard they had trees. They had some fruit trees. The building was large enough so that they could house the cattle and the flock in that part of the building. And she talked of the kids having to take the geese out to eat. They would take the geese and the ducks and other fowl that went with it out of the city, down the street, Hauptstrasse they call it, and they would take them out into the fields to pick up grain or whatever, insects, etc., and feed out of the village during the day, and the kids would bring those not only the animals, the cattle, and the fowl back into the village in the evening, and all the cattle that came in with them, they knew exactly where they would take off for their particular place where they lived. And she talked about that. She talked about watching the geese and so on. But life being hard as it was for the older children, the families were so large, and we knew, of course, from the records that there were 8 children, and the youngest was only 6 months old when they came to America. The older kids had to take care of the younger kids because the mother was just bogged down taking care of new births almost every year or every other year. Okay?
Did your father ever talk about, was he born, he was born in Russia? Or was he
Yes, but he was 6 months old when
oh,
they
so
came.
he had
So
no memories.
what he talked about was from history that he learned from Grandpa Bauman.
Did your
Yeah.
mother ever tell you why her family in particular left?
Yes, in fact, this probably pertains to all the people that left because they didn't want to become Russianized. They were, of course, opposed to persecution, religious, and conscription into the army, although many of them did have to serve, and being forced to live the Russian way. And then, in 1862, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, and there was a lot of advertising, and there's free land in America. And so they loved the land because they were farmers. And that's probably what enticed them to leave. Conditions as they were becoming there, the opportunity in America, that's really all the motivation they needed. And
Did
so
your
off
mother
they went.
Did your mother ever express any fear about leaving Russia and traveling? Or
All of them did. All of them did. Number one, they knew they would never be back there again. This was their homeland. And they knew that whoever they left behind were family, friends, or whoever, that they might never see them again. And so, yes, I think it had a devastating effect on some of them. And not only that, they had to sell all their belongings. So they just simply had to, they had to depart from everything that was dear to them. And they talked about auction sales, even there, so the people that were there. And then when they had a little money from that, then they went to get their tickets. And there was another problem because the travel agents ripped them off, sold them second-class fare, and then they got dumped into third class and had to come back aboard ship in the steerage section, which of course is the lowest class there is. Mother talked about that many, many times because they were stuck down there. The kids were getting head lice and so on. They finally were able to get some kerosene from one of the cursors and to get their hair washed in kerosene to kill the lice. So I think things were very, very difficult and unpleasant to get to America on that 14 2-week trip to America. Yeah.
what do we have here?
What we have here is the name of the ship that brought them to New York from Bremen, which left Bremen on April 30 and apparently arrived in the harbor at New York on May 7th, 1912. These dates were never exact because I did research and I tried to find the, as the saying goes, at Bremen they were scheduled for a ship called the Wilhelm Kaiser, number 3. Wilhelm Kaiser ships were number 1 and 2 and 3. And they were ticketed for Wilhelm Kaiser the third, and one of the kids, I don't know which one, was very sick with the flu or something, and so they were refused passage on that ship, and they were held back for 2 weeks, I guess, until they could, pass the medical inspection, and then they came on a ship called the Crown Prince Silly, and that brought them to New York. And actually, they left Bremen on May 5 and came on May 14 or 16. So these dates are incorrect. However, they're close, and the name of the ship is correct. Now down here, this is taken from the manifest. The father, age 39, and the mother, also age 39. The oldest girl was Matilda, age 13, and then Reinhold, the oldest boy, was age 11. My mother was age 9, and Gust 7, Alexander 6, Gotthilf 3 years old, Lundina 2, and Waldemar, who was the infant, was 5 or 6 months old. And they arrived in New York, and there they boarded a train into Chicago, and from Chicago to Lair, North Dakota. Now there's an interesting story following it. They came to Lair, North Dakota in May, a blustery May day. You know how May is in North Dakota? Some days are nice and some are windy and cold. And Uncle, Grandpa Fiechner's brother, had already been in America for a year, and he was there to meet them at the station, wearing sheepskin coat. And it was cold. These poor kids were freezing. And one of the older boys said, Uncle, whatever, why are you wearing that coat with the wool on the outside? Wouldn't it be warmer if it were turned around with the wool on the inside? Well, his remark to the little fellow was, have you ever seen a sheep that wears its wool on the inside? Yeah, well, anyway, that's the story.
Did all of the children survive the voyage over?
Yes, and then after they were here in America in 1912, the last 3 children were born in North Dakota. They left North Dakota in 1918 and moved to South Dakota.
Oh, so they moved down as a family to South Dakota.
Pardon?
They moved as a family
Oh,
down
yes.
to South Dakota?
In fact, when they left Lair, they moved to a small town across the river west of Mobridge, and they had 2 wagons, 2 milk cows that followed, the 4 horses that were pulling the wagons, and any of these kids that were older than 6, they walked the entire 110 miles a full week till they made the trip to Isabel, South Dakota.
Do you know why they left North Dakota?
They couldn't make a living there. There was nothing there for them to make a living. They were told then they should move to that place in South Dakota and do some ranching. That's entirely ranching country there. And they only stayed there 6 months because that wasn't going to work for them. They moved to a better location then, which was quite near to the place where my dad found my mother. Mm-hmm. This is the Declaration of Intention, which every immigrant father had to fill out at the county clerk's office declaring their intention to become a United States citizen. And so we have their names and the name of the county they were living in and where they came from, which village, and if their nationality and the name of the ship they came from, and where they were, their destination in North Dakota, and on down the line where they came from, the name of the ship and the date, and it was signed. Then they had 5 years to become a citizen.
And did your grandfather succeed in
He was either too busy moving around or excuse me, or else he forgot about it because he didn't follow through with this. And in 5 years they left North Dakota. He might have had this idea that it applied only in North Dakota. He didn't become a citizen until the middle 1930s, at which time he had to apply for some welfare, and he had to then become a citizen, which he did. What we have here is my grandfather Bauman, and this is his citizenship paper, and this was done at the county seat in Selby, South Dakota, and it's a notarized copy of it, and it states the county they were living in and various legal descriptions here, and that he has applied for citizen, and I guess they took an oath of office, and they denounced the Tsar of Russia, that they were not going to be loyal to any other country except here, the United States. So that's basically what that is, the citizenship paper. Now then, my father being only 6 months old when they came, there was a problem with that, whether he was a citizen or whether he wasn't. So he became quite concerned about that later on. In August 1938, he had written to the Department of Labor and Naturalization Service, and they told him, I guess, basically in legal terms, that he became naturalized when Grandpa Bauman became a citizen. And these other documents are merely notarized statements. And that's what this is too. It just simply says that he's a resident and that they know him and they know of his knowledge that, I guess, that whatever this is true and correct, and then it's notarized. And my mother, of course, not being a U.S. citizen, became naturalized then when she married my father, as did all others. There were some complications. I can't go into those. It's a long story with an aunt who's on that picture, and we had to do a lot of legal work to get her to be eligible for Social Security, which is later on life. This little sod house is 9 miles north of Lair, North Dakota, Schumacher Farm, they tell me, and this is where they moved and where they lived for the 5 years they were in North Dakota, close to Lair, North Dakota. This is the 8 children here that lived in that house. And you'll notice that there's a staircase on one end of the house. They never had room enough inside for all the kids and for sleeping. Some of them had to go up into that short attic.
Whose family is this?
This is the Fiechner family.
Fiechner family.
Matthias Fiechner. We're getting away now from the Bauman side over there. Yeah.
And do you know who's in the photo?
Pardon?
Do you know who's in the photograph?
Well, yes, I do. I have that somewhere else, but
You know,
the first 8 children, my mother's on there too, and her older sister, and the younger siblings.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay.
The parents are not on that picture.
So it's just the children?
Yeah.
You said the first 8 children?
Mm-hmm. They're the, yeah. This is a picture of the entire Fiechner family. They're all on here, from the oldest to the youngest. And this is Grandpa Fiechner, Matthijs Fiechner, and Katharina is the mother's name, and that's her. The youngest is Harold, he's in the center. The oldest is this lady here, Matilda, followed by Gus, Alex, Reinhold, and Godhild, and Walter, and then the other girls are Lundina and Amelia, Elizabeth, and last of all I want to mention my mother. She's on here too. This picture had to be taken about 1929 or perhaps 1930.
What's in your mother's lap? Is that, or is that just her dress, or?
I don't know. That's a part of her dress. Yeah.
So with all these aunts and uncles, was there one that you were closest to when you were growing up?
Well, the thing is, by the time we were, in the 30s, the older ones, except for Uncle Reinhold, all went out west. The only one that stayed behind, and he lived in Mobridge, was Uncle Reinhold, and Aunt Matilda stayed here. Well, I think this little fella right here, the youngest one, Uncle Harold, we were probably closest to because he stayed behind. He passed away, but he stayed here in South Dakota. All the others left to find work, and they went out west, and they stayed out west. Mm-hmm. Yep. Their names are on here, and so you can catch that, I think, if you need to. Yeah. This is a document, a photocopy taken from Grandpa Fiechner's Bible. And of course, the Bible was their diary. And in the Bible, they recorded all the important events, that, of course, being the names of the children and the dates that pertain to their birth and perhaps their baptism. And so this list in German writing, of course, is of all the children. And I think yeah, and we obtained this, and it's mentioned there that they came from the Bible. The Bible remained in the possession of the youngest child, and we don't know now where that could be. But the genealogists that are doing research these days, they look for those Bibles, and then they find that, and they translate it into permanent records. Here we have my grandfather Bauman, and unfortunately we do not have more than 1 or 2 pictures of him. But at age 74, he became ill, and he went to Britain, South Dakota, to live with one of his children, and he developed cancer and passed away at Britain, South Dakota. This is a picture of him in the casket.
How old were
for
you
the
when
funeral.
he passed away?
He was 74. And the interesting thing is at age 72, he was still out in the harvest field and was pitching bundles and what have you. And then his health began to fail.
And how old were you when he passed away?
Well, it was in 1943, so I was 20. I suppose I was 20 years old. I was born in 1923. Yes.
Do you remember the funeral?
Pardon?
Do you remember the funeral?
I don't think we were even allowed to go to the funeral. I think only the parents went. Yeah. It was a different thing about funerals in those days. We know where he's buried, however, yeah. This apparently was taken on October 3rd, 1920. And this is my mother and father's wedding picture. That is the nicest and best picture I have of them together.
Do you know how they met?
Yes. Ultimately, when the Fiechner family had moved the third time from North Dakota to South Dakota and moved again, they were within 15 miles of the Bauman farm. And, of course, all coming from the same village in Russia. Word gets around that this family is living there, and this family's living there, and this family's living there. So they decided one day to go visit these Fiechner people, the Baumans did. And my dad, being one of them, met my mother, who was 18 years old at that time. And he became interested in her. So sometime later, he took the buggy and his sister, and these men never went alone to visit a potential bride because they were too bashful. They always took either their brother or their sister with them for support. They had to have some support. So he took his sister, my dad took his sister along, and they went to the Fiechner place with the buggy. It was 15 miles, so they drove a long ways to get there. And he liked my mother, and then he said to Grandpa Fiechner, I would like to marry Rosina. And Grandpa Fiechner says, no. The custom is that the oldest girl marries first. And you can marry Matilda if you like, because she's older than Rosina. And my dad said, no, I don't want Matilda, I want Rosina. Well, he said, I need to give it some thought. This is all conducted in German, of course. And when he went back again, then the next time, the Fiechner grandpa said, well, okay, you can have Rosina if you want her that bad, but you know that the oldest girl should marry first. But I have to tell you this right now, I have no dowry to give her. And in German, that is Aussteier. My dad said, well, don't worry about that, because I have means to support her. I don't need the cows and whatever that goes with the wedding. Okay, so he gave my mother 6 chickens for her dowry. Then, shortly thereafter, Aunt Matilda, the older sister, got married, and her dad was able to give her 3 cows. That rankled my dad, and he never forgot about it. He was the kind of person that kept the memory forever. And he talked about that many, many, many times. Mother got 6 chickens. Her sister got 3 cows. Didn't. That just did not sit with him. However, that's the story. Yeah.
When you think back to your childhood, how would you describe them as a couple?
Well, sometimes you mix hot and cold and you get lukewarm. That might apply. Yeah. Mother was kind. She was patient. She was good to everybody. She would she would give her life. She would do anything for anybody, but not my dad. No. He kept his distance from people. He liked some people. He disliked other people. He liked what this farmer was doing. He was industrious. He worked hard. He didn't like that farmer, spent a little too much time in town in that watering hole, and so on. So yes, he was different. He was a disciplinarian and a critic. But all in all, he was a successful person because he studied and he's self-taught. And so when he was 19 years of age, he got to become a part-time rural mail carrier. And they used horses at that time, had a route that was 36 miles long, and they needed to have a halfway place where they kept a spare team. And they drove 18 miles, changed teams, and drove the other 18 miles, and did this all in one day, every day for a period of time. And then, after they were married, he became a county assessor. And so he traveled the entire county. After Spring's work, he was out assessing property. And he did that for 20 years. Well, in 1929 came this terrible crash. The stock market crashed, the banks were closing, and all that. And then he was appointed as he was well known because he played organ in church and because of all these other things. He became a director for liquidating that particular bank that they had their money in. It took 2 years to liquidate a bank at that time and to sort it all out, and they then returned 10 cents on a dollar to the people that had a deposit. And some people probably had $100 in that bank, and they got $10 out of it after waiting 2 years for it. Yeah. So anyway, he did a lot of good things, however, and he was a good carpenter, very good carpenter. Yeah.
When you think back, were you close to him when you were growing up?
No, actually not. Well, it didn't matter much. They told us what to do, and we did it, and that pretty well sums it up. However, I spent time in the Navy, World War II, and after I got back home and back on the farm, I really wanted to do a lot of things differently, and so we disagreed. We agreed to disagree a lot, and of course, when we got married, they just decided they better hurry up and move off the farm, and then I could take over the farm, which we did. Yeah. What we have here is a picture taken in Bismarck of my mother and father, and this was about 1974. At that time, of course, they lived in Java, in town, but they made at least an annual trip to Bismarck, primarily for medical purposes, to see the doctor. And then they would come to see us, and we could, very rarely that they stayed. They wanted to get back home all the time, but sometimes they stayed. And that's an interesting story, too, about that, because there are landmarks in a city. And they knew that coming to Bismarck on Highway 10, you drive down Main Street until you're by this great big building on the corner, which happens to be the Bank of North Dakota, 7 stories high. And that's the corner. You make a right turn, and then you drive 2 more blocks, and you're at the clinic, Q&R clinic at that time. Okay, that's how they always made their trips to Bismarck and found where they had to go, and then they parked the car and went to see the doctor. Well, they hadn't been in Bismarck for 2, maybe 3 years. And then they came. Not this time, but a different time. And as usual, they kept driving on down Main Street, and there's this big building, and here's where we turn right. And they turned right, and all the cars were coming from the other side, and it had become a one-way street. And they were driving against all this traffic. And Mother threw up her hands and said, "Gota, gota, gota, they're going to run into us." But drivers, being courteous as they were, they swerved around them. They couldn't do anything but proceed. They had to go 2 blocks north. All the traffic was going south. It was 7th Street. My gosh. And they made their way, and when they got to the clinic, after they had seen the doctor, we had the Drumstick Cafe at that time, the restaurant. The phone rang, and it was for me, and it was I don't know if it was my dad or my mother. Said, "Please come over here and drive the car for us. We don't know our way out." And I walked over to the clinic and got the car and gave them transportation. This picture is of their 50th wedding anniversary. And the celebration, what it was, and we weren't there because of obvious reasons, I guess we couldn't be there. And so my mother and my dad and the 2 people with them were their sponsors or their attendants at their wedding. And this is Mother's older sister, the one that Grandpa Fichtner said, "You got to marry the oldest sister first." Well, that's her. And this is a younger brother to my dad. So this was their 50th wedding anniversary. And then this was the 68th. That was their last one. And that's in the church basement. And again, their anniversary. And then this was in 1988, early October, and toward the end of November, my dad had passed away. My mother continued to live until 2005, till she was 103 years old. And on this picture, we honored my mother at her 100th birthday. The photo itself was taken a few years earlier when she was still active with her garden and flowers, and these are our garden flowers that she's holding here. And so we used this picture for my mother's 100th birthday in Java, South Dakota. And at that time, she was already living with a caregiver because she had Alzheimer's at that time already for 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're gonna let
But it's a nice picture.
Okay, we're gonna continue here with the church. So why don't you tell us a little bit about?
Well, okay, I can tell you about this church. This material that we're looking at now was when the church in Java was celebrating an anniversary. But what we have here now is the history of the country church. And as you well know, when the immigrants came to this part of the country, to America, to Dakotas, and to Canada, one of the first things they did, they would hold church services in someone's home. And there were 2 things they wanted to establish as quickly as they could. And the first one was a church, and the second was a school. And so as soon as they could afford to buy the lumber, the labor was always furnished and donated. They would build, and generally it was a small church out in the country. And following church, they would build a schoolhouse. But this church is the one that was closest to our home, in fact, less than 2 miles away. And by today's standards, it's almost as small as a modern day closet in a big house. They had a bell tower, and they generally tried to put a church at close to an intersection or close to a well-traveled road, but that wasn't always possible. With this church, it was up in the prairies, on the prairies, far from everywhere, and the 12 or 15 families that were living in the area got together and decided they needed to have a church. So they got together in 1897 and hauled the lumber from a distance of 15-20 miles and started building this church. 2 years later, they had the little church finished. Well, then there was the problem of a pastor. Of course, there was none in the immediate area, so generally a member of the church would, suffice to say, they would read from a book. But occasionally they would bring in a pastor once a month by buggy from 15-20 miles away and have a Sunday sermon. Soon there were about 6 of these little country churches in the area, and in 1903 the congregation put in a call for a graduate of the seminary in Germany. And this young pastor by the name of Reverend Kirchdorfer answered that call and came to America and began pastoring in these 6 churches. So he would have to, of course, travel by buggy to the different places. Well, at least they had a pastor then, but he could only make one church every Sunday, so they had a pastor for a sermon once a month, and then the members would do what they usually did for the other 3. This pastor stayed and sent back to Germany for his bride, and she came to America, and in 1905 they were married. Well, they furnished a house for them in the small town of Java, South Dakota, and he then served the 6 churches around there. And finally, he was even given orders to establish more churches, and I think it was within his power that he did establish one additional church. The picture that we're looking at here now was our church, and it was called in German the Hoffnungstal Gemeindekirche, the Hoffnungstal Parish Church. Okay, so the picture beside it, if you're able to take that picture, also was also close to the area of our little church. Well, I remember quite well going to that church because I can remember back as far as when I was 4 years old and would stand on the pew and look out the window, and from that vantage point I could see the railroad and see the train go by. And I always had a remark to make, be it that I didn't know enough to whisper to my brother, I would speak out loud, tell him about the train. Anyway, later on then my father played violin, and they were able to get an organ, and he played the organ in that church. Well, slowly Uh, about 1909, they had a church built in Java, and then some of these small churches simply emerged. They decided to disband and go to the town. And the little church on the prairie stood there and was served until 1930. And at that point, the roads were better, cars were better. People decided we'll close that little place and go to town. The little church was then sold for $300, and a group of people came with horses and wagons. They jacked it up and loaded it on wagons, and they hauled it a distance of about 12 miles and set it up at a trading post that had 2 or 3 other churches already, but they needed a Lutheran church. So they established a Lutheran church there and put it on a foundation. And with the $300 they received for the church, they put a permanent chain link fence around the churchyard and the cemetery. And that is still there to this day. I mowed hay in that churchyard, and they are now, of course, maintaining it to with this perpetual care that most of the congregations have. Anyway, my father played every Sunday in the small church. They had built a barn there for the horses. During the winter, they needed to have some shelter. And then when the church went into the city of Java, the town of Java, then my father played the church in town for a long, long time, over 40 years. Now then, this Reverend Kirchdorfer that came from Germany stayed 40 years. And I think it was his mission that he would work for 40 years and then retire, because that's exactly what he did. In 1943, he retired and he moved to Iowa. And because he was an experienced German from Germany, the Wartburg Seminary in Iowa used him to teach young pastorate interns the German language. And that's basically the story. One more thing. This created a problem at that trading post, bringing another church in there, which some people were opposed to. And 6 months later, there was a fire, and the church is no longer there. Arson was the answer.
Really?
Now, we're looking at a picture of a depot. Chicago-Milwaukee Pacific Railroad came by Java, and 1901 or thereabouts, the train brought in immigrants, and this was a trainload practically of immigrants that came from South Russia, and they were going to make their home there at Java. So they took this picture of the people that came in on that particular train.
So did the train run right through the town?
No, and generally in most cases it did, but there was a problem insofar as the railroad was built first, and then the town was platted, and there was an area of about a half mile between the main line and where the town was platted. So, however, there was a spur built into the city of Java, and the train came in then on the spur. Most small towns, you'll remember that the railroad would run right through town, simply because the elevators were there and they needed to run past the elevator. This was a half mile from the main line, so they built a spur and came in on the spur line. However, it didn't pose any problems going in and out. And that depot building is still standing today. Some people are trying to restore it, and some people don't care. It doesn't serve any purpose, so they don't care what happens to it. However, it would be good to restore it. It's historic. Perhaps someday the Historical Society will put it on the National Register.
So did you ever work on the railroad or ride the train when you were a kid?
Yeah, I did both. Rode the train, and I also worked on the railroad. But this was after I was healed from surgery. I took a course in telegraphy and in depot agent work. And that was 1953, and jobs were available. However, it meant going out west, but we did. We went to Oregon with our young son, and I worked for a while on the Southern Pacific in the depot in Oregon, and then later in Idaho. And after that, we came back to Dakota.
Okay, what do we have here?
Well, what we have here is a bit of nostalgia. This is the house on the farm where I was born. And I don't remember the day I was born, but there's a story behind that. And most of the other outbuildings are gone. The farm has been vacant for nearly 10 years. And so the buildings, of course, are falling into some disrepair. But this is where the entire family, all of us, my brothers and sisters, grew up. And where the two windows are, that's the upstairs, and those were our sleeping rooms. And they were terribly, terribly hot during the summer. We slept on a straw mattress when I was very young. And 3 boys in a bed that was shaped like a hammock. No one wanted to be in the middle because that was a bad place to be. Anyway, my father built this house by himself in 1920, the year they were married. And their marriage was consummated in October 1920, so he probably worked most of the summer getting that house ready. And they had a small barn. Yes, and there's a story following this. Now, we're going to go way up to 1934, and this was the beginning of the Dirty 30s. I had mentioned earlier that my father was a director at a failed bank that had to be liquidated. And then, of course, the banks were reclaiming land that had been mortgaged. And my father had a mortgage on the homestead, which consisted of 80 acres. And that was the part the buildings were on, including a small pasture and perhaps a little agricultural area. And he owed money on that, and they had no money then to pay off that mortgage to the bank. I wasn't aware of this until many years later, that my dad and mother and the 2 young sisters drove to Pierre, South Dakota, where he had made an appointment with the governor. He asked that governor to please not let the bank foreclose on the land that consisted of the homestead. And whatever he said there must have worked, because the bank never asked for a payment until about 1938, when crops were beginning to grow again, and they had money to pay the bank. So that was a successful visit, and I never realized that a person could go to the governor of a state and ask for a favor such as that was. However, I guess he was determined enough to do it.
So you said you were born in this house, and there was a story behind your birth. Did you want to tell us?
Yeah, February 18, 1923, winter. And I guess it was the due date for my birth. And so Father took the team and sled and drove a couple of miles to neighbors by the name of Schlepp, and brought the woman that served as a midwife to assist with the birth, and she stayed a day or two after that. Yeah, and then I was 2 years old, and I contracted pneumonia. I think it was a rather severe case of pneumonia. I have to credit my mother for saving my life with that, because she succeeded with whatever she did in the way of solving that illness. And I think they talked about mustard plasters and what have you. However, I survived, and I got over that pneumonia, and I was fine. All the children were born in that house. And when it got down to the oldest sister, we boys were big enough, and we were called in the house this one particular day, and my father was there. This was in July, and he made us each a great big slice of jelly bread. And he said, now you go outside to eat that, and you stay out. And a Model T Ford came into the yard, and a man got out carrying a little black bag. And a few hours later, someone said we had a sister. and, well, there are dubious things that must be done, I guess, to solve whatever problems there may have been. And with that respect to the oldest sister, my younger sister was born in 1928. They did the same thing again. They sent us outdoors, and the doctor came with his black bag and delivered another baby or girl. Yeah. So there we were, 5 kids, 3 boys and 2 girls, which made the family complete. And then it was time for school. Well, this little schoolhouse was a mile from our farm. My parents, I don't know if it was my mother or both, were a little bit doubtful that my brother should walk alone to school. There was no such thing as driving someone to school, because the elderly were always busy with their work. So they said I needed to go with him, and we could both go to school at the same time. So we did. We walked every day, all year long. It was very, very seldom. Only in the severest weather did my father take the team to take us to school. There was one year, however, I was 8 years old then. We kept a teacher at our house, and there were more frequent rides at that time. And that's understandable, I guess. I'm the little guy in front with the long sleeves, And my brother, with his head tilted to the side, is my older brother, Martin. Now you can see as you look at that, there's quite a number of kids in that school, and that was quite typical in those days because they were required to be in school until age 17 if they couldn't pass the exam for the 8th grade. And this appears to be a typical situation where there is at least one boy and one girl that are old enough to opt out of school if they couldn't pass the final exam. The lady in the doorway is the school teacher. She was a very nice German lady and an excellent teacher, treated us real well. On that same picture with my brother and I are two of my aunts and one uncle. And I would guess there's probably 14 or 15 kids on that picture. This last picture is of our family. This was taken in the 1930s. I can't. I think I wrote the year on the back, 1937 probably. From left to right, in the back row, is my older brother, Martin. He was deceased in 1996. And then in the center is me, Clarence, and to my left is my younger brother, Harold. He went on advanced education and earned a doctorate in Oregon, has been teaching at the university in Salt Lake City for probably 30 years. And the first row on the left is my father, and then my youngest sister, Hilda. She is a widow and has been since 1979. And then the other sister, Rosina, called her Rosie all the time, married, and then last of all, my mother.
What were their married names?
The married name for Hilda was Schaefer, Mrs. Otto Schaefer. The married name for Rosie or Rosina was Mrs. Wilmer Stiegelmeyer. Hilda's husband lived in Mobridge, South Dakota, and Rosie's husband lived at Selby, South Dakota. My older brother passed away, I think I mentioned that, in 1996.
So let's start here. Tell me a little bit about what Martin was like when you were a kid.
Martin was a little different than I was. I was more of a maverick than he. He was more amicable because if he was told to do something, he did it. He never argued about it. I may have been stubborn enough to say, no, I don't want to, or whatever. Not so with my brother. And then when the problem arose with our schooling, second year of high school, I had volunteered to stay at home and work on the farm after we had dropped out if Martin would go back and continue his education. However, I think my dad favored him more, and so he agreed that he would stay home. So as a result, we both stayed at home. He did get married, but I was gone in the service at the time, and When I got back home, he was single again and didn't remarry until um, around 1978. In 1993, I noticed that he was ill, that he wasn't feeling right. And so I brought him to Bismarck to the clinic, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And a little later on, they diagnosed him with dementia. And after a stay here, I took him to Mobridge, to a nursing home, and he only survived 2 years with the illness, and he passed away. So during the time, however, that he was single, he loved to play organ, and he even played in the church organ at times. And he and a bunch of guys got together. They formed a band, and Martin played piano while some of the other guys, in fact, one of the other fellows was Donnie Sauer, Marilyn's younger brother, and they were good enough to play for dances. So they had a lot of fun. Martin married, and they had only one son, who lives by Rapid City, and his former wife is in the nursing home.
So how about Harold? When you were growing up, what type of a person was he?
There was the brain in the family, and he could help anyone with any problem intellectually. When he was in high school, everyone referred to him as Shakespeare. And he had a mission. He was going to memorize the dictionary. And wherever he went, he carried a dictionary with him. So it seemed to me that he had a responsibility. Brother Harold, born July 18th, 1925. Physically, he was always a little bit weaker than the rest of us, so he didn't have to do the heavy work on the farm that us older boys were accustomed to. But intellectually, he was way ahead of everyone. And he actually passed his first grade test while lying on a table in a prone position with a broken leg when he was in the first grade. So we've passed that milestone some time back. Well, he went on to high school, and they referred to him as Shakespeare because he seemed to be available for anybody's problems that they needed to solve. Finished high school as a valedictorian, and the following September, he enlisted in the Navy. And so he served in the U.S. Navy for 2.5 years. And this was out west in Idaho and Oregon. He remained out at the West Coast, attended college in Eugene, Oregon, until he had his master's. He would teach a year to earn some money and go back to college for a year, and then teach a year, and then go to college a year. He had very little help financially from home. My father was of the opinion that we should all become farmers. We didn't need a high-class education. So he didn't donate too much financially toward his education. However, he worked it out by teaching high school and then going back to college. Ultimately, he got his doctorate at the University of Iowa. And following that, he got married, and they moved to Salt Lake City, accepted a position at the University of Utah as a history professor, and he's still there. His wife is deceased. Now, Hilda, she's the young one. She was the tiny one also. And she loved to do farm work. She loved to get out in the field and work. And all of the kids, she finished high school, went on to normal at a time when teachers could get a certificate by attending 2 summers at a normal school, and this was in Aberdeen, South Dakota. And she went on to teach a country school for a few years, and then took additional education in Aberdeen, and became an elementary teacher in Java in the city school. And later she married, and the man she married was working for a utility company, so they moved around some. They ultimately went to Minneapolis and then to Dallas, and from Dallas, Texas to Lodi, California. This is where she's still living. Her husband passed away in 1979. And Rosie also attended high school and attended Aberdeen Normal for 2 summers, and became a teacher in country school for a few years. She married a farmer from Selby, Mr. Wilmer Stiegelmeyer, still married to him, and they had 4 children, I believe. And Hilda, they had two daughters. Yeah.
Okay.
So that kind of sums it up with the siblings.
We have one last thing up there.
Oh, what we have over there is my confirmation certificate. I believe I was 13 years old at time 13 plus, the year I was confirmed. And if you look at that confirmation certificate, you'll notice that it's all in German. And I was confirmed, of course, in the German language. We had to study for 2 summers, 4 to 6 weeks at a time, to prepare for the final exam to become confirmed and be classified as a member of the church. This is a Java Lutheran, St. Paul Lutheran church. And our test was not in a separate area or a separate room with a teacher or whatever. This was done during the sermon, a regular sermon, with the pastor asking the questions. In my class, there were only 6 confirmants, but we all passed. That was in 1934.
Okay. Well, we'll ask our...
No, I'm going to take that back. I think I might have to correct that. It was in 1937. 37, yeah.
Well, we'll ask the couple of concluding childhood questions that we have.
Yes.
The first one, when you think back to your childhood, what is one of the scariest experiences you had as a child?
There are several. One, I'll mention this first, was running home from school when I was probably 6 years old. And we had a direct route that we followed going to and from school. And this one particular warm September day, running home, and we walked barefoot. I didn't mention this, but we kids walked barefooted all summer. And we didn't wear shoes until we started going to school. Well, you don't even like to wear shoes after you walk barefooted all summer. So after school was let out, we would start on the way home and take our shoes off. And we'd run home barefooted. And there's this particularly nice rock on the way up a hill that we liked to step on as we went toward our farm. And I stepped on that rock on a nice warm September day, and something wiggled beneath my feet, and I had stepped on a snake. Well, be as it may, the snake didn't get me because I outran that snake by a long ways on the way home. Okay, oh, that was one incident that was a little bit scary. The other incident, of course, that was rather traumatic was when my younger brother broke his leg while we were sliding down the hill. And that, of course, is something that I will remember for the rest of my life. Then another incident happened. My mother did not learn to drive a car, but Dad was out in the field a ways from the farm, and she wanted to see her mother. And her mother's family was about 4 miles from our farm. So she loaded us kids into the Model T, and we visited her mother, and we came back home. Now here's the thing. She didn't need to let Dad know that we had gone. She didn't want anyone to know that we had taken the car and had gone. So the idea was to put the car in the garage. And she drove into the garage, but she didn't know how to stop. Well, I needn't tell you what happened after that. She ran into the other end of the garage, and because of that, Dad found out what had happened. And he was a very unhappy camper. Yeah. Didn't do much damage, but still, it had happened. That was kind of crazy. Those are some incidents. There may have been more, but they stick out.
Okay, how about a happy childhood memory? One of the most happiest times in your childhood?
I had a godfather from my baptism that gave me a special toy for Christmas. Other than that, we had no toys except what we decided we could do ourselves to have fun. He gave me a metal toy that simulated a sand loading operation. And we could take it outdoors and we could fill the hopper with sand and watch the sand run out of the bottom end. That was unbelievably exciting. And ultimately, the poor thing got run over by a wagon or something. I was happy. I was happy. And beyond that, I think I enjoyed it very much when I could go with Mother to the garden to hoe weeds. And I would work with her, and she would work and sing at the same time. And then there are more incidents where Mother would sing to us a lullaby at night, and that was before we slept upstairs. We had a fold-out Davenport, or whatever you'd call that, and all three of us boys slept in on that Davenport, and she would sing to us, and I think I showed you that song. Yeah, those were good times. hmm I like to remember some of the good times because we had a tough growing up life.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about your childhood that we didn't discuss?
Oh, I think I've gone over most of it. I need to tell you this. Yes, I was 8 years old the year we were boarding a school teacher, and she was not German. She had come from Iowa, and many of the school teachers came north out of Iowa in those days. Well, I knew she was in the kitchen, and this was probably 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. The weather was nice. It was early fall, and I wanted to show off a little bit of my prowess. And so I jumped on Roxy, which was the horse, and I galloped full speed past the kitchen window. I definitely wanted to be sure that she was watching. And we galloped past the house, and Roxy saw the mound of dirt that the gopher had dug out and stopped short, and Clarence kept going. I went over the top of the horse and down I went. That I have to laugh when I think about it. My main concern was that she didn't see what had happened. Yep. I took a tumble. So that's about it.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.